What happens when the world you built to escape prejudice turns on you? Dr. Alani Finch, a titan of the hospitality industry, walked into her own five-star restaurant to honor her late father's memory. She had a reservation, a quiet corner table booked weeks in advance. But the maitre d' saw a black woman, not the CEO. She was told with a smile as cold as steel, "We're fully booked." What followed was an act of absolute power that would echo through the media. But the story doesn't end there. Because when you unleash a storm, sometimes you end up at the heart of the hurricane. The autumn air in New York City had a crisp, unforgiving bite to it, the kind that hurried people along the pavement and painted noses a cheerful cherry red. But inside the impossibly elegant foyer of Urae, the city's most coveted new restaurant, the atmosphere was one of serene, insulated warmth. Gilded light from a multi-tiered chandelier cascaded over polished marble floors, and guests whose hushed conversations were a symphony of wealth and influence. This was Dr. Alani Finch's world. More than that, it was her creation. Urae was the crown jewel of Ethelred hospitality, the global empire she had inherited from her father and quadrupled in value over the last decade. Every detail, from the thread count of the linen napkins to the precise wattage of the bulbs in the sconces, had passed under her exacting eye. Tonight, however, she wasn't here as the CEO. She was here as a daughter. It was October 24th, the third anniversary of her father's passing. Their tradition had always been to celebrate milestones, not mourn losses, at the finest table they could find. He had been a man of immense presence and even greater dreams, a chef who started with a single diner in Atlanta and dared to imagine a world where his food and his people were celebrated on the grandest stages. Urae was the fulfillment of his ultimate vision. Tonight's dinner was a quiet pilgrimage, a solitary communion with his memory. Alani, dressed in a tailored charcoal wool coat over a simple but elegant black dress, approached the maitre d's station. She wasn't adorned with flashy jewelry or logos. Her power was in her posture, her calm, and the quiet intensity in her dark eyes. The woman at the podium was the picture of curated sophistication. Young, blonde, with a severe chignon and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A small engraved nameplate read Isabel. "Good evening," Alani said, her voice low and warm. "I have a reservation for one at 8 o'clock. The name is Finch." Isabel's eyes flickered over Alani's form, a micro-assessment that took less than a second but communicated volumes. It was a look Alani knew well. It cataloged her skin color, her simple attire, her lack of a designer handbag, and filed her away in a mental drawer labeled unlikely. Isabel tapped a few keys on her tablet, her painted fingernails clicking softly. Her expression remained placid, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The practiced warmth receded, replaced by a cool, professional dismissal. "Finch," she repeated, drawing the name out as if it were an unfamiliar, slightly unpleasant taste. "I'm not seeing anything under that name." Alani's brow furrowed slightly. "That's strange. It was booked 3 weeks ago. Dr. Alani Finch, for table 12 specifically." Table 12 was her father's favorite, tucked away in a quiet alcove with a perfect view of the restaurant's central water feature. She had personally ensured it was blocked out for her tonight. Isabel tapped again, with more theatricality this time. "No, I'm terribly sorry. There must be a mistake. We are fully committed this evening. In fact, we're booked solid for the next 2 months." The finality in her tone was designed to end the conversation, a polite but firm wall. Alani felt a familiar, weary tightening in her chest. It was the same exhaustion she'd felt 1,000 times before. In luxury shops where she was ignored, at real estate open houses where she was mistaken for the help, in boardrooms where her ideas were dismissed only to be applauded when repeated by a white male colleague. She had built Ethelred hospitality into a fortress to shield herself and others from this exact feeling. Yet here it was, at the very heart of her empire. "Perhaps you could double-check," Alani pressed, keeping her voice even. "It's a rather important evening for me." "There's nothing to double-check," Isabel replied, her smile tightening into a thin, condescending line. "As I said, we are fully booked." She emphasized the words as if speaking to a child who didn't understand. Just then, The heavy oak doors of Ori swung open again. A white couple, both in their late 50s, ambled in, laughing. They were dressed well but casually, the man in a sports coat and the woman in a cashmere sweater. "Good evening, Robert, Helen," Isabel chirped, her entire demeanor transforming. The icy facade melted into a gushing, sun-drenched welcome. "So good to see you again. I wasn't aware you were joining us tonight." "Last-minute thing, Isabel?" The man, Robert Henderson, boomed. "We decided we couldn't be bothered to cook. Any chance you can squeeze 2 old regulars in?" Isabel tapped on her tablet for a fraction of a second, a pantomime of searching. "Well, we are incredibly busy," she said, leaning in conspiratorially. "But for you, Mr. Henderson, I think I can make something work. We have a lovely corner spot that just opened up." Alani stood frozen, a statue of disbelief. The corner spot. The description was vague, but the implication was a sledgehammer blow. She watched as Isabel personally escorted the Hendersons past the velvet rope, past the waiting area, and into the warm, gilded embrace of the dining room. They passed directly by the alcove containing table 12. It was empty. The tablecloth was pristine, the single candle unlit, the wine glass gleaming, waiting for a guest who, according to the gatekeeper, did not exist. Isabel returned to her post, her face resetting to a mask of professional indifference. She looked at Alani, who hadn't moved an inch, and raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Is there something else?" she asked, her tone heavy with the unspoken message. "You should leave now." The weariness in Alani's chest was gone. The cold exhaustion had been burned away by a sudden, white-hot surge of incandescent rage. It was a rage sharpened by grief, honed by a lifetime of slights, and now aimed with pinpoint precision. "Yes," Alani said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "There is something else." Isabel sighed, a barely audible puff of exasperation. The inconvenient woman was still here. "Ma'am, I've already explained the situation. There are no tables. If you'd like, you can try making a reservation for January." "My reservation," Alani stated, each word a chip of ice, "is for tonight, at that table." She gave the slightest nod towards the empty waiting table 12. "The one you just walked past?" Isabel's mask of politeness began to crack. A flicker of genuine annoyance showed in her eyes. "That table is reserved. The party is simply running late. Now, if you'll please step aside, you're holding up the entrance." This was the final turn of the screw. It wasn't just a dismissal anymore. It was a fabrication, a blatant lie constructed on the spot to reinforce the initial prejudice. The insult was no longer just about a table. It was about her intelligence, her right to even question the fabricated reality presented to her. "The party is not running late," Alani said, her voice resonating with a newfound authority that made Isabel pause. "The party is here." A man in a sharp suit, the restaurant's general manager, Gregory Davies, had noticed the standoff and began to glide over. He was in his mid-40s, with slick-back hair and the anxious, perpetually scanning eyes of a man trying to keep 100 plates spinning at once. "Is there a problem here, Isabel?" he asked, his voice a low murmur meant to de-escalate. "This woman is insisting she has a reservation, Mr. Davies," Isabel reported, her tone shifting to that of a beleaguered employee dealing with a delusional customer. "I've explained that we're fully booked, but she refuses to leave." Mr. Davies turned his practiced, placating smile on Alani. "Ma'am, I do apologize for any misunderstanding. My maitre d' is simply stating the facts. We are, unfortunately, at capacity. Perhaps I could assist you in booking for another night? I could even offer you a complimentary glass of champagne on your return." It was the classic move: patronize, pacify, and remove. Treat her like a disgruntled, irrational customer who could be bought off with a cheap gesture. Alani's gaze shifted from Isabel to Mr. Davies. She saw the same lazy prejudice, the same reflexive dismissal. They were two sides of the same coin, gatekeepers of a kingdom they didn't realize she owned. "The problem, Mr. Davies," Alani said, her voice steely and clear, cutting through the foyer's ambient hum, "is not with my understanding. The problem is with your staff's blatant discrimination." The word discrimination hung in the air like a foul odor. Mr. Davies's smile vanished, replaced by a defensive scowl. Now hold on. That is a very serious accusation. We do not discriminate at Orea. Don't you? Alani challenged, her eyes flashing. I arrive on time for a reservation made weeks ago for a specific table. Your employee tells me no such reservation exists and the restaurant is full. Moments later, a white couple walks in without a reservation, and the same employee magically finds them a table, lying to my face that my designated table is for a party that is running late. What would you call that, Mr. Davies? A simple clerical error? The manager was momentarily speechless. He looked at Isabel, whose face had paled. The Hendersons, now seated, were too far away to hear, but a few other guests waiting for their coats were beginning to stare. This was escalating into a scene, the one thing a restaurant like Orai was designed to avoid. There has been a misunderstanding, Mr. Davies stammered, trying to regain control. Isabel, check the system again, thoroughly. Isabel, now flustered, fumbled with her tablet. I did, sir. There's nothing under Finch. My name, Alani said, enunciating with chilling precision, is Dr. Alani Finch, and I suggest you check your system not for a customer, but for the owner. Check the registry for Ethelred Hospitality. A complete, profound silence fell over the foyer. The name Ethelred Hospitality was whispered in reverence in their industry. It was the gold standard, the pinnacle. It was to them an abstract concept, a name on their paychecks and on the letterhead of their corporate policies. It wasn't a person. It certainly wasn't the black woman they were trying to shove out the door. Mr. Davies's face went from pale to ashen. His mind furiously tried to connect the dots. Finch. Ethelred's founder was Finch. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He looked at Alani, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not an inconvenience, but the formidable, steely-eyed woman from the cover of Forbes magazine he'd seen just last month. Isabel, following his gaze, felt a wave of nausea. The blood drained from her face as the name clicked into place. Dr. Alani Finch, the CEO, the ghost in the machine, the ultimate authority, the woman who could end her career with a single word. She stared at Alani, her mouth slightly agape, a silent scream of horror trapped in her throat. Oh God, Mr. Davies breathed, the sound barely a whisper. Alani stood before them, a pillar of calm fury. The power dynamic in the small, gilded space had not just shifted, it had been utterly inverted. The gatekeepers were now standing at the mercy of the person they had tried to cast out. Let me rephrase my earlier question, Mr. Davies, Alani said, her voice dangerously soft. The problem isn't a clerical error, is it? The problem is that your staff looked at me and decided I did not belong in my restaurant. On the anniversary of my father's death, the man who built this company on the principle that a seat at the table should be open to everyone who earns it. She took a step forward, and both Isabel and Mr. Davies instinctively recoiled. So tell me, she continued, her gaze burning into them, do you still think a complimentary glass of champagne is going to fix this? The silence in the foyer was no longer just a lack of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. Isabel stood paralyzed, her face a mask of pure terror. Mr. Davies, visibly trembling, opened and closed his mouth several times, but no sound emerged. The machinery of his professional poise had completely seized. Alani's gaze swept past them, into the dining room. She saw the soft lighting, heard the gentle clinking of silverware on porcelain, the murmur of contented conversations. It was a perfect scene of curated luxury, but to her it was now utterly spoiled, a beautiful facade built on a rotten foundation. Her father's dream at this moment felt like a mockery. Her decision coalesced not as a thought, but as a certainty. It was a surgeon's choice. The infection was too deep, the limb too gangrenous. It had to be amputated. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved with calm, deliberate speed. She dialed a single number. Marcus, she said when the call connected, her voice devoid of any warmth. It's Alani. On the other end was Marcus Thorne, her chief of operations and her father's oldest friend. He was a steady, wise presence who had been with the company since its inception. Alani, is everything all right? I thought you were taking the night off at Ore. I am at Ore, she replied, her eyes locked on Mr. Davies. But the night is over. I need you to assemble the emergency response team. HR, legal, and PR. Conference call in 10 minutes. Emergency? What happened? Is there a fire? A health code violation? Marcus's voice was sharp with alarm. A moral violation, Ilani said cryptically. A deep systemic rot I'm about to cut out. Just be ready. She hung up before he could ask more questions. Then she turned her full attention back to her two petrified employees. Mr. Davies, she began, her voice resonating with an absolute finality that sent a shiver down his spine. You are the general manager of this establishment. The culture of a restaurant flows down from the top. You are responsible for the actions of your staff, for the standards you uphold, and for the values you represent. And what I have seen here tonight is a complete and utter failure of leadership. Dr. Finch, I am so sorry, he stammered, his hands clasped in front of him like a supplicant. This is a terrible mistake, a lapse in judgment. Please allow me to rectify it. We can have Isabel. Isabel is a symptom, Mr. Davies, not the disease. Alani cut him off sharply. The disease is an arrogance that allows you to believe you are the arbiters of who is worthy to walk through these doors. It's a blindness that prevents you from seeing a person and instead only seeing a stereotype. She took another step, entering the main dining area. Her voice rose not to a shout, but to a clear, commanding tone that carried across the room. Conversations began to falter as heads turned towards the source of the disruption. Attention, everyone, Alani announced. Diners paused, forks hovering midair. The staff, waiters, sommeliers, busboys, froze in place. My name is Dr. Alani Finch. I am the CEO of Ethelred Hospitality, the company that owns this restaurant. A ripple of shock and murmurs went through the room. I came here tonight to honor the memory of my father, the founder of this company, a man who believed in the power of hospitality to bring people together, to treat every single guest with dignity and respect. But the welcome I received at my own front door was a betrayal of everything he stood for. She gestured back towards the foyer where Isabel and Davies stood like statues in a tragedy. I was denied my reservation. I was lied to. I was judged and dismissed based on the color of my skin, and the management of this restaurant endorsed that decision. Her gaze swept over the entire staff. She saw the head chef, Antoine Dubois, a man she had personally headhunted from Paris, peering out from the kitchen pass, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. She saw the servers, some looking horrified, others just bewildered. A fish rots from the head down, Ilani declared, her voice ringing with conviction. And this establishment requires a complete and total reset. It needs to be purged. She turned back to a now openly weeping Isabel and a stone-faced Mr. Davies. As of this moment, your employment with Ethelred Hospitality is terminated, effective immediately. Both of you. Gasps echoed through the dining room. You will be escorted from the premises. Your final paychecks will be mailed to you. Do not attempt to contact anyone at this company again. She wasn't finished. Her gaze moved to the kitchen door. Chef Dubois. The chef flinched as if struck. He hesitantly stepped out into the dining room. Did you hear what happened at the front door, chef? I heard a commotion, Madame Finch, he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. And you did nothing? She pressed. You, the leader of the heart of this house, heard a guest being mistreated, and you stayed in your kitchen? It was not my plate, he began. It is always your place to uphold the integrity of this house, she thundered, her composure finally breaking into raw anger. It is every single person's place. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her voice returned to its cold, decisive tone. Mr. Davies, as your final act, I want you to inform every single employee on shift tonight, front of house and back of house, that their services are no longer required. Ori is closing, effective now. Everyone is terminated. The entire room fell into a state of stunned, absolute shock. A young waiter dropped a tray of glasses, the shattering sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence. The busboys, the sommeliers, the line cooks, the dishwashers, all of them, caught in the blast radius of Isabel and Davies's prejudice. It was a brutal, indiscriminate act of corporate warfare. "Dr. Finch, please," Davies begged, finding his voice at last. "The others, they did nothing wrong. My sous chefs, the servers, they have families. This is madness." "This is a consequence," Alani corrected him, her expression unreadable. "It's a lesson that will be heard throughout every corner of this company. We have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of poison, and when you find cancer, you don't just snip at the edges. You cut it all out to ensure it never grows back." She then addressed the stunned diners. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for the disruption to your evening. There will, of course, be no charge for anything you have consumed tonight. Please gather your belongings and exit in an orderly fashion. Ori is now closed." No one moved for a moment, too shocked to process the command. Then slowly, chairs began to scrape back. People started murmuring, pulling out phones to record the unprecedented corporate meltdown. Alani Finch stood alone in the center of the dining room, a queen who had just ordered the razing of her own castle. The immediate, satisfying rush of righteous vengeance coursed through her veins. But as she watched the bewildered faces of the now jobless staff, a small, cold flicker of something else ignited deep within her. It was a feeling she couldn't yet name, but it felt disturbingly like the prelude to a fall. The exodus was a surreal, hushed affair. There was no shouting, no dramatic protests from the fired staff. They moved as if in a trance, stunned into silence by the sheer swiftness and brutality of the verdict. Their faces were a gallery of disbelief, fear, and quiet resentment. A young hostess cried silently as she collected her purse from a locker. A line cook, a man with tattoos covering his arms, simply stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. They filed out into the cold New York night, their lives irrevocably changed in the span of 10 minutes. The diners, after a flurry of whispers and surreptitious phone recording, also departed, their gossip-fueled excitement warring with a sense of unease. They had just witnessed a raw, unfiltered display of corporate power, and it was both intoxicating and terrifying. Within 30 minutes, the restaurant was empty, utterly, eerily silent. Half-eaten plates of exquisitely prepared food sat on the tables like abandoned relics. Wine glasses, still partially full, caught the light of the grand chandelier. The only sound was the gentle, indifferent gurgle of the central water feature. Alani walked slowly through the ghost ship she had created. She ran her hand along the back of a velvet-upholstered chair. She looked at the intricate floral arrangement on the bar, which would be wilted by morning. She had won. She had faced down bigotry in her own house and had eradicated it with surgical precision. The victory should have been sweet, a triumphant validation of her power and principles. But it wasn't. The silence of the room felt less like peace and more like a vacuum. It didn't feel clean. It felt sterile, lifeless. The righteous fire in her veins had cooled, leaving behind a hollow, aching cold. The faces of the fired staff, not just Isabel and Davies, but the young busboy who looked no older than 17, the sommelier who had always greeted her with a respectful nod during her inspections, haunted the empty space. Had they all been complicit, or were they just collateral damage in a war they didn't know they were fighting? She finally walked to table 12, her father's table. She sank into the chair, the plush velvet offering no comfort. She looked at the single unlit candle. She had come here to feel closer to her father, to sit in his favorite spot and feel the warmth of his legacy. Instead, she had turned his dream into a tomb. What would he have thought? He was a man of principle, yes, but also of immense compassion. He believed in second chances. He had once kept a dishwasher on staff who had been caught stealing food, making him work off the debt and giving him a raise when he proved himself trustworthy. "You don't throw away a whole pot of soup because of one bad carrot," he used to say. "You fish out the carrot." Tonight, Alani hadn't just fished out the carrot. She had thrown out the soup, shattered the pot, and burned down the kitchen. Her phone buzzed, startling her in the profound quiet. It was Marcus Thorne. She had forgotten about the emergency call. She answered, her voice subdued. "Alani, what in God's name is happening? My phone is blowing up. I've got security alerts from Oriai, text from the regional manager. Someone said you fired the entire staff." "I did," Alani confirmed, her voice flat. She explained the entire incident, from Isabel's dismissive tone to Davies's pathetic attempt at a cover-up. She recounted the lie, the seeding of the Hendersons, the insult to her and her father's memory. Marcus was silent for a long time on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a sorrow that cut Alani deeper than any anger could have. "Lonnie," he said, using his old nickname for her, the one her father used, "what they did was inexcusable. It was vile and it deserved a severe response. Davies and the Metro D, a public firing, blacklisted from the industry? Absolutely, 100%. He paused. "But everyone, Alani? The dishwashers? The pastry chef's assistant who just started last week? You took a bomb to a knife fight." "It was a statement, Marcus," she defended, though her own conviction was wavering. "It had to be absolute. No ambiguity. I had to send a message that this poison will not be tolerated anywhere in Ethelred." "You sent a message, all right," Marcus sighed. "But are you sure it's the one you intended? Think about the story. Not the one you lived, but the one that's going to be told tomorrow. What do you think it's going to be? CEO righteously corrects injustice? Or billionaire CEO has a tantrum and fires 100 working-class people over a perceived slight?" The cold feeling in Alani's gut intensified, crystallizing into dread. She hadn't thought about that. In her rage, she had only seen the chessboard from her side. She hadn't considered how her move would look to the rest of the world, a world that didn't have the context of her grief, her history, her father's legacy. They would only see the final brutal act. "Someone at the restaurant was filming, Alani," Marcus added grimly. "A guest named Robert Henderson. His wife posted it on her social media 10 minutes ago. It's already starting to spread." Alani felt her blood run cold. Henderson, the man who had been the beneficiary of the discrimination, was now its narrator. He hadn't heard the initial conversation. He wouldn't have understood the context. All he would have seen, all he would have filmed, was a powerful black woman in a commanding voice, terminating an entire staff, turning his pleasant evening upside down. She sat in the silent, empty monument to her father's dream, the victor of a battle she had decisively won, and for the first time she felt the terrifying, sickening certainty that she was about to lose the war. The storm broke before dawn. By the time Alani arrived at her penthouse apartment, her phone was already vibrating with a furious, unrelenting intensity. The video, as Marcus had warned, had gone viral. It was 37 seconds of grainy, poorly angled footage shot from across the dining room. It started at the exact moment Alani's voice rose to address the room. There was no context of what had happened in the foyer. There was no image of Isabel's sneer or Davies' dismissiveness. There was only the sound of a shattering glass, followed by Alani's amplified, commanding voice. "It is always your place to uphold the integrity of this house," she was seen saying, pointing a finger toward the kitchen. Then, the brutal climax. "Everyone is terminated. Orai is closing. Effective now." The video ended with a shot of the shocked faces of the diners and the terrified staff. Helen Henderson, who had posted it, had added a simple, devastating caption. "Absolutely insane power trip by the owner of Ori NYC tonight. Fired her whole staff on the spot because her table wasn't ready. My heart breaks for those poor workers." That was the narrative that took root. It was simple, sensational, and perfectly crafted for the outrage economy of the internet. By 6 a.m., Shakhan Ari CEO and Chakshur cancel Alani Finch was trending on Twitter. News outlets, smelling blood in the water, pounced. The initial headlines were sensational and damning. "Billionaire hospitality queen fires entire restaurant staff in shocking tirade," the Daily Chronicle. "CEO's meltdown at five-star restaurant leaves 100 jobless," Gilded Post. "Is this the worst boss in America?" Video shows Ethelred CEO Alani Finch's brutal purge. BuzzFeed News. The story was framed as a classic case of the out-of-touch, tyrannical elite. Alani was no longer a victim of racism. She was the perpetrator of a massive injustice against the working class. She was the modern-day Marie Antoinette, complaining about her seat while the peasants lost their livelihoods. By mid-morning, Isabelle Dubois and Gregory Davies had found their voice. They appeared on a national morning show. their faces etched with practiced sorrow and victimhood. Isabel, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, recounted her version of the story. "She just seemed angry from the moment she walked in," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "We had a slight computer glitch with her reservation, and we were trying to sort it out. I offered to find her another spot, but she just exploded. It was terrifying. She was screaming about her father and her company. We were just trying to do our jobs." Gregory Davies nodded gravely beside her. "I've been in this industry for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. To throw away the careers of so many hardworking people, chefs, servers, dishwashers who have nothing to do with a reservation mix-up, it's unconscionable. They have rent to pay, families to feed, all because Dr. Finch had a bad day." They never once mentioned race. It was a masterful, insidious performance. By omitting the core reason for the conflict, the blatant discrimination, they painted Alani's reaction as disproportionate, unhinged, and monstrous. They were the relatable victims. She was the unfeeling monster in the penthouse. Public opinion turned against her with breathtaking speed. Comment sections and social media feeds were a cesspool of vitriol. The definition of an angry black woman, a disgrace. "I hope every one of those employees sues her into oblivion. See? This is what happens when you give them money and power. They become worse than anyone. I'm canceling my stay at all Ethelred hotels. Boycott them all." The racial undertones were impossible to ignore. Alani was being held to a different standard. A white male CEO who did the same thing might have been labeled a ruthless leader or a hard-nosed businessman. But for her, the labels were more loaded, more personal, more venomous. She was fulfilling a stereotype they were all too eager to see confirmed. The real karma, she was beginning to understand, was not a lightning bolt from the heavens. It was the slow, grinding machinery of public perception. It was having her truth stolen, twisted, and sold back to the world as a lie. Her righteous act of defiance had been reframed as an act of petulant tyranny. The phone rang again. It was Richard Caldwell, the chairman of the board of Ethelred Hospitality, a man from her father's generation who had always been skeptical of her leadership. His voice was as cold as the grave. "Alani, I've just seen the morning news. Our stock has dropped 7% in pre-market trading. 7%. Our brand partners are calling, threatening to pull out. We have a full-blown catastrophe on our hands. The board is convening an emergency meeting at noon. You had better have a damn good explanation for this." The chill of dread that had started in the empty restaurant had now become a full-body rigor. She hadn't just lost control of the narrative. She was in danger of losing control of everything. Her company, her father's legacy. Her entire life's work was teetering on the edge of an abyss, and the person who had pushed it there was her. The Ethelred Hospitality boardroom was on the 80th floor of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, a space designed to project unshakable power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a sprawling kingdom under their command. But today, the view offered no comfort to Alani. The city below felt like a hostile territory, full of accusers and enemies. She sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. The 10 board members, predominantly older white men in bespoke suits, sat with grim expressions, iPads glowing in front of them with plummeting stock tickers and scathing news articles. The air was thick with disapproval. Marcus Thorne sat to her right, his face a mask of concern. He had tried to prep her, to strategize, but she had been in a daze, the public's vitriol echoing in her head. Richard Caldwell, the chairman, cleared his throat. He was a stern, imposing man with silver hair and a patrician air, a corporate titan from an era where problems were solved behind closed doors with handshakes and quiet threats, not in the chaotic arena of social media. "Alani," he began, his voice dripping with icy disappointment, "this board entrusted you with your father's legacy. For years, you have grown this company with remarkable skill. But this is an act of self-immolation. You haven't just damaged a single restaurant. You have set a fire to the entire Ethelred brand, a brand synonymous with grace, stability, and impeccable service." He gestured to his iPad. "We are being called toxic. tyrannical, discriminatory, the very thing you claim to be fighting against. The irony is staggering. Our hotel bookings are seeing cancellations at a rate I haven't seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Another board member, a hedge fund manager named Jonathan Vance, chimed in. Legal has already flagged a dozen potential wrongful termination lawsuits. A class action suit is not just possible, it's probable. The cost of this tantrum will be in the tens of millions before we even factor in the brand damage. Alani finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. She refused to let them see her crumble. It was not a tantrum. It was a response to a clear and undeniable act of racism that occurred at the front door of our flagship property. She laid out the events calmly and factually, explaining the significance of the evening, the details of her reservation, Isabel's lie, and the immediate seating of the white couple. Caldwell listened impatiently. All right, let's accept your version of events. The hostess and the manager behaved deplorably. They should have been fired. Immediately, quietly. But the entire staff, Alani, the busboys, the sous chefs, you gave our enemies a weapon and told them exactly where to aim it. My father's motto was one team, one standard, Alani retorted, her voice gaining strength. The standard was broken and the team was silent. Inaction in the face of injustice is complicity. I made a decision to enforce that standard in the most unequivocal way possible. You made a decision that is costing our shareholders hundreds of millions of dollars, Vance snapped. Your standard is bankrupting us. The argument raged for over an hour. It became clear that the board didn't care about the moral intricacies of the situation. They didn't care about the racism or her father's principles. They cared about the bottom line. They saw a PR crisis spiraling out of control, fueled by an emotionally compromised CEO who had acted with her heart instead of her head. Finally, Caldwell held up a hand, silencing the room. There is only one path forward, he said, his eyes fixed on Alani. A full, unconditional public apology. You will go on television, the same show that hosted your former employees, and you will apologize. You will apologize to the staff you terminated, to our shareholders, and to the public. You will announce the creation of a relief fund for the fired employees and offer to rehire any who wish to return under new management. Alani felt the blood drain from her face. Apologize? Apologize for reacting to racism? It felt like a betrayal of herself, of her father, of every person of color who had ever endured a similar slight. I will not apologize for being angry at prejudice, she stated firmly. I will not validate their narrative that I was simply an angry black woman having a meltdown. Then you are giving us no choice, Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. The board has the votes, Alani. We can suspend your duties as CEO pending an internal review. We can place Marcus as interim CEO and issue the apology on your behalf. We will do what is necessary to protect this company from its own leader. The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. They were going to strip her of her power, take her father's company away from her, and publicly humiliate her in the process. She was trapped. If she stood by her principles, she would lose everything. If she bent the knee, she would lose herself. Marcus placed a hand on her arm, a silent plea for her to think, to be strategic. He understood the injustice, but he also understood the reality of the situation. They were in a gilded cage and the bars were closing in. Alani looked around the table at the cold, unsympathetic faces of the men who held her fate in their hands. They were the true power, the silent arbiters who had allowed her to play CEO as long as she made the money. But the moment she acted in a way that threatened their wealth, the moment she became a liability, they were ready to discard her. The hard karma wasn't the viral video or the public hatred. It was this moment, the soul-crushing realization that the power she thought she had was merely conditional. She had built a fortress, but she had forgotten that others held the deed to the land it was built on. She looked out the window at the city below, a world she had once felt she commanded. Now she had never felt so powerless. For 2 days, Alani locked herself away in her penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a silent, judging audience. The ultimatum from the board echoed in her mind. Apologize or be exiled. Every fiber of her being screamed against it. An apology would be a lie, a concession to the very people who had wronged her, a reinforcement of the racist caricature she had become in the public eye. She spent the time not watching the news or scrolling through the endless tide of hatred online, but by going through her father's old things. His journals, filled with recipes and business plans, were also peppered with his thoughts on life. She found an entry from the early days, after a bank had denied him a loan for what the officer had called a niche culinary concept. "They don't see the vision," her father had written. "They only see the man. They think my hands are only good for labor, not for creation. Anger is easy. Anger is a fire that warms you for a moment, but it will burn your house down if you let it. Building is harder. Building is the only answer. You must build something so strong, so excellent, they can no longer deny the vision. Building is the only answer." The words hit her with the force of revelation. In her pain and rage, she had stopped building. She had started burning. Her father wouldn't have fired 100 people. He would have found the bad carrots, yes, but then he would have retrained the rest. He would have turned the ugly incident into a powerful, teachable moment. He would have rebuilt his team, making it stronger, more aware, more aligned with his vision. He would have used the moment not to destroy, but to create a new, better standard. Her action, born of righteous fury, was powerful, but it wasn't leadership. Leadership was not about the righteous demolition. It was about the difficult, patient work of reconstruction. The karma that had hit her wasn't a punishment for her anger. Her anger was justified. The karma was a brutal lesson in the nature of true power. The power to fire everyone was cheap and easy. The power to change minds, to educate, to rebuild a broken culture, that was real power, and she had squandered it. On the third day, she called Marcus. "Set up a press conference," she said, her voice clear and resolved. "No softball interviews, all the major networks, no pre-approved questions." She walked into the press conference not as a victim, nor as a penitent. She walked in as a leader who had made a mistake. She wore a simple dark blue suit, projecting calm authority. She stepped to the podium, cleared her throat, and looked directly into the cameras. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Dr. Alani Finch, and I am here to talk about what happened at my restaurant, Ori, 3 nights ago." She did not start with an apology. She started with the truth. She recounted in stark, unflinching detail the racism she experienced. She named Isabel Dubois and Gregory Davies, and she explained why their actions were a betrayal of every value Ethelred hospitality stood for. "My anger in that moment was real. It was profound, and it was justified," she stated, her voice firm. "I will never apologize for my reaction to being dehumanized. To any person of color who has ever been made to feel less than, your anger is valid." A murmur went through the room of journalists. This was not the groveling apology they had expected. "However," she continued, her tone shifting, "what I did next was a failure of my own leadership. In my desire to send a message against intolerance, I used a sledgehammer when I should have used a scalpel. I punished the many for the sins of a few. I caused genuine harm to dozens of employees who were not responsible for the incident, and for that I am unequivocally sorry." This was the apology, not for her anger, but for her method. It was nuanced, honest, and powerful. "To the staff of Ori who lost their jobs because of my decision, I failed you. I failed to separate the guilty from the innocent, and in doing so, I betrayed the very principle of fairness I sought to defend. To you, I offer my deepest apologies and my immediate action." She then laid out her plan. Ethelred Hospitality was establishing a multi-million-dollar relief fund for all terminated employees, guaranteeing their full salaries for the next 6 months while they sought new employment. Furthermore, every single employee, except for Davies and Dubois, was being offered a position at another Ethelred property should they wish to accept it. But she didn't stop there. "Ori will remain closed," she announced, "not permanently, but until it can be reborn. I am personally overseeing the development of a new industry-leading diversity, equity, and inclusion training program. It will be mandatory for every single one of our 50,000 employees worldwide, starting with the executive board. Ori will reopen only when its entire new staff, from the general manager to the dishwasher, has completed this program and can truly embody the values of its founder." She was transforming her biggest failure into a company-wide mission. She was turning the ashes of that night into the foundation of something stronger. The press conference was a turning point. The narrative, so long controlled by her detractors, began to shift. Some still called her a tyrant, but many more saw the nuance. They saw a leader who was not just powerful, but accountable. Someone willing to admit a mistaken method without abandoning her principles. The board, faced with her decisive, strategic, and publicly lauded plan, backed down. The stock began to creep back up. She had not given them the simple apology they wanted. She had given them something far better, a forward-looking plan that turned a PR disaster into a statement of progressive corporate values. Her life did not snap back to normal. The internet's memory is long, and her reputation would forever be complicated. But she was no longer a caricature. She was a woman who had faced a storm, both external and internal, and had learned to navigate it. The real karma had hit her hard. It had stripped her down, forced her to confront the limitations of her own power, and nearly cost her everything she held dear. But in doing so, it had forged her into a different kind of leader. Not just the owner of her father's company, but the true inheritor of his vision. To not just be successful, but to be excellent. Not just to cast out the bad, but to build something better in its place. Alani Finch's story isn't just a simple tale of revenge or a lesson in humility. It's a gripping look at the complexities of power in our modern world. It shows how a single, justifiable act of anger can be twisted by the funhouse mirror of social media, and how true strength isn't found in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to rebuild. Her journey reminds us that fighting injustice is messy, and sometimes the biggest battles we fight are with our own methods. Was her initial action a righteous purge or a reckless overreach? The answer is probably somewhere in between, and that's where the most compelling stories live. What do you think? Was Alani's final act one of redemption or a calculated corporate maneuver? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think, please hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates a story with depth, and be sure to subscribe for more real-life dramas that go beyond the headlines.